Some debts can't be measured in currency. Callan Whitmore learned that truth the morning he found a woman bleeding into the dust near his property line. She was tall, taller than most men he'd known, with dark hair matted with blood and clothes torn from violence he didn't want to imagine. When she opened her eyes and looked at him, there was no plea for help in that gaze-only warning. Within hours, armed riders would arrive at his door, and the choice he made in that moment would either save him or destroy the last thing he had left. The letter had arrived 3 days earlier. Callan didn't need to open it to know what it said, the same thing the previous 4 had said. 45 days to settle his accounts or lose the ranch. The land his father had broken his back to claim, the soil Callan had watered with his own sweat for 20 years, would belong to someone else. He'd stood in his empty kitchen that morning, the paper trembling in his calloused hands, and felt something inside him go hollow. Now he was checking the irrigation channels that fed his withering crops, trying to calculate if he could squeeze one more season from land that seemed determined to betray him. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the heat was already pressing down like a physical weight. His boots kicked up dust with each step, the dry earth cracking beneath him like broken promises. That's when he saw her. She was collapsed against a rock formation, one arm wrapped around her ribs, the other hanging useless at her side. Blood had soaked through the leather of her clothing, dark and still spreading. Callan froze, his first instinct screaming at him to turn around, to pretend he'd seen nothing. Getting involved with tribal matters was asking for trouble he couldn't afford. The territories were a careful balance of invisible boundaries and unspoken agreements, and crossing those lines usually meant violence. But she was dying. He could see it in the way her chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate pulls. Callan moved forward before his mind could overrule his legs. As he approached, her eyes snapped open, dark, fierce, aware. She tried to push herself up, failed, and her hand moved to something at her belt. A blade. Even wounded and weak, she was ready to fight. "Easy," he said quietly, raising both hands. "I'm not here to hurt you." She studied him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, like she was reading every thought behind his eyes. Then her gaze shifted past him, scanning the horizon, and something like fear crossed her face. Not fear of him, fear of what was coming. "They're looking for you," Callan said. It wasn't a question. She nodded once, then her eyes rolled back and she slumped against the rock, unconscious, maybe dying. Callan looked back toward his ranch house, barely visible in the distance, then at the woman, then at the empty landscape around them. No one had seen him yet. He could walk away, let nature or whoever was hunting her finish what they'd started, save himself the inevitable trouble. His hands were already moving, sliding under her shoulders, testing her weight. She was heavy with muscle and height, and getting her back to his place would mean every second counted. The wound in her side was deep, and the amount of blood she'd already lost meant she might not survive the trip. But leaving her wasn't an option his conscience would allow. He lifted her with a grunt, her dead weight pressing against his chest, and started the long walk back. Every step felt like a choice he couldn't take back. Every minute that passed was another minute closer to whoever was tracking her finding them both. By the time he reached his barn, his shirt was soaked with her blood and his own sweat. He kicked open the door and carried her into the darkness, laying her on a bed of hay in the back corner. Only then did he see the markings on her clothing, intricate beadwork, patterns he'd seen before on the few tribal members who came to trade in the distant settlement. This wasn't just any woman, and he'd just made himself part of whatever storm was following her. The wound was worse than Callan had thought. He'd seen injuries before. Ranch work provided plenty of opportunities for blood, but this was different. The gash across her ribs was deep, deliberate, the kind of damage that came from someone trying to kill, not wound. He worked quickly in the dim light of the barn, tearing strips from an old shirt to make bandages. His hand steady despite the situation spiraling beyond his control. She woke while he was cleaning the wound, her entire body going rigid. Her hand shot out and gripped his wrist with surprising strength, her eyes wild and unfocused. For a moment, Callan thought she might break his arm. "You need to stay still," he said, his voice low but firm. "That wound keeps bleeding. You won't last another hour." She stared at him, breath coming in short gasps, clearly trying to decide if he was a threat or an ally. Then her gaze dropped to the water basin beside him, to the clean cloth in his hand, to the bandages he'd prepared. Slowly, her grip loosened. "Why?" Her voice was rough, barely more than a whisper. Callan didn't have an answer that made sense even to himself. Because leaving you to die didn't seem right. She studied him for a long moment, then leaned back against the hay, allowing him to continue. Her jaw was clenched tight, but she didn't make a sound as he pressed the cloth against the wound. Most men he knew would have been screaming. "They'll come looking," she said after a while. "Soon." "Who?" "Everyone." She closed her eyes. "My people. The ones who did this. Maybe others." Callan tied off the bandage, his mind racing through implications he didn't want to face. What happened? An ambush. 3 men, maybe 4. I was hunting alone, tracking elk beyond our usual territory. They were waiting. She touched the bandage carefully, testing it. They knew I'd be there. "Someone from your own people?" Her eyes opened, sharp and alert despite the pain. I didn't say that, but she didn't need to. The silence that followed told Callan everything. This wasn't just tribal politics he'd stumbled into. This was betrayal, the kind that got people killed in ways that couldn't be taken back. He stood and moved to the barn door, peering through the gap. The sun was higher now, burning off the morning haze. In the distance, beyond his withering fields, he could see dust rising against the horizon. Riders, still far enough away that he couldn't count them, but close enough to be inevitable. "They're coming," he said quietly. Behind him, he heard her trying to stand, heard her sharp intake of breath as the movement pulled at her wound. When he turned, she was on her feet, one hand pressed against the barn wall for support, the other reaching for something that wasn't there, looking for a weapon she'd lost. "You can't fight," Callan said. "You can barely stand. Then I'll die standing." There was no bravado in her voice, just simple fact. "But I won't let them find me hiding in your barn. That would make you a target too." Callan looked at her, this tall, wounded woman who'd rather face down her killers than put him at risk, and felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent months watching his land die, watching his future crumble, feeling helpless against forces he couldn't control. But this was different. This was a choice he could make. He walked to the corner of the barn and pulled back a tarp, revealing the rifle he kept for predators. Not much, but it was loaded and he knew how to use it. "You're going to stay hidden," he said, checking the chamber. "And I'm going to deal with whoever comes riding up to my property uninvited. You don't understand what you're risking." "Maybe not." He turned to face her. "But it's my risk to take." The dust cloud was closer now, minutes away, maybe less. And Callan Whitmore, a man who couldn't save his own ranch, was about to put his life on the line for a stranger whose name he didn't even know. 3 riders emerged from the dust cloud, their horses dark with sweat. They wore a mix of tribal clothing and items clearly taken from settlers, a combination that made Callan's stomach tighten. These weren't hunters or scouts. These were men who existed in the spaces between 2 worlds, belonging to neither, which made them more dangerous than either. Callan stepped out of the barn before they could dismount, the rifle held casually but visibly across his chest, not pointing at anyone but impossible to ignore. The lead rider, a man with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, pulled his horse to a stop 15 feet away. "Morning," Callan said, his voice level. The scarred man didn't return the greeting. His eyes moved past Callan to the barn, then to the house, then back to Callan's face. "We're tracking someone. A woman. Tall, dark hair, wounded. You seen anyone like that?" "Just me in the dirt out here," Callan said. "What's she done?" "That's not your concern." The man's hand rested on the knife at his belt. "You mind if we look around?" "I do, actually. This is private property." The second rider, younger and twitchy, laughed. "Private property. You hear that? Man thinks lines on paper mean something out here." Callan kept his attention on the leader. "They mean something to me. And they should mean something to anyone with respect for another man's land." The scarred man studied him, clearly trying to decide if Callan was brave or stupid. "You're in a bad spot to be making stands, friend. That's a lot of dead crop behind you. Place looks like it's one bad season from being dust. That's my business. And the woman we're tracking is ours." The man leaned forward in his saddle, his last chance. "You seen her or not?" Callan's grip tightened on the rifle. Every instinct screamed at him to just tell them no and let them move on. But something in the way they carried themselves, the way they'd phrased the question, told him they already suspected. They were testing him, waiting to see if he'd lie. "I told you there's no one here but me." The scarred man's eyes narrowed. Then he made a gesture, and the other 2 riders began to spread out, flanking toward the barn from both sides. Callan raised the rifle, not quite pointing it, but making his intention clear. "That's far enough. You really want to die for someone you don't even know?" the leader asked. "I want you off my land." For a moment, nobody moved. The sun beat down on them and Callan could feel sweat running down his back under his shirt. 3 against 1, and they all carried weapons. If this turned into a fight, his chances weren't good, but backing down now meant they'd tear his barn apart, find her, and probably kill them both. Then a voice called out from behind the riders, strong and clear despite the pain it must have cost. "You're looking for me." Callan's heart stopped. She was standing in the barn doorway, one hand pressed against the frame for support, the other hanging at her side. Even wounded and swaying, there was something commanding about her presence. The 3 riders turned their horses, and Callan saw recognition flash across their faces, followed quickly by something else. Fear. "Ayanna," the scarred man said, and there was weight in how he spoke her name. "You should have stayed down, and you should have finished what you started." She took a step forward, and Callan saw blood seeping through the bandage at her side. "But you always were weak. Dakota. Even when we were children," the man called. Dakota's face hardened. "You don't know what you've cost us." "I know exactly what I cost you. Your chance to betray everything our people stand for." Callan glanced between them. Understanding dawning. This wasn't about a random attack. This was about something deeper. Something that had been building for a long time. And he'd just stepped into the middle of it. Dakota's hand moved to his knife. "The farmer protected you. That makes him part of this now." Ayanna's eyes met Callan's for a brief moment, and he saw something there he hadn't seen before. Regret. She'd tried to warn him, tried to leave, and he'd refused to listen. Now they'd both pay the price. The moment stretched thin as wire. Dakota's hand was on his knife. The other 2 riders had their hands moving toward their weapons, and Callan's rifle was suddenly feeling inadequate against 3 men who looked like they'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Then Ayanna spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like broken glass. "Tell them, Dakota. Tell them what you promised the settlement men. Tell them how you plan to sell our hunting grounds for gold and whiskey." Dakota's face went dark. "You don't know what you're talking about. I know you met with them 3 times. I know you drew maps showing where our camps move with the seasons. I know you told them when our warriors would be north chasing buffalo." She took another step forward, and Callan could see the effort it cost her. "And I know my father would have you stripped of your name for what you've done." The younger rider looked at Dakota, confusion clear on his face. "Is that true?" "She's lying to save herself," Dakota said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "My father is Otaktai," Ayanna said, and the name landed like a stone in still water. "Chief of our people for 20 winters. And when he finds out what you've done..." "Dakota, there won't be enough distance in this territory for you to run." Callan felt his stomach drop. Chief's daughter. He'd saved the chief's daughter. The implications of that crashed over him like a wave. If these men killed her, it would mean war. If they killed him too, nobody would ever know what really happened. But if she survived, Dakota seemed to be doing the same calculation, and Callan could see the moment he made his decision. The knife came out smoothly, and the other 2 riders drew their weapons in response. 3 armed men against a wounded woman, and a farmer with 1 rifle. "Your father isn't here," Dakota said, "and dead women don't tell stories." He kicked his horse forward, and everything happened at once. Callan raised the rifle and fired. The shot went wide. He'd been aiming for center mass, but the horse's sudden movement threw off his aim. The bullet caught the animal's shoulder instead, and it screamed and reared, throwing Dakota from the saddle. The other 2 riders charged, and Callan knew he didn't have time to reload. Ayanna moved faster than someone with her injury should have been able to. She grabbed a pitchfork leaning against the barn wall and swung it in a wide arc that caught the second rider across the chest, knocking him sideways. He hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. The 3rd rider made it to Callan, knife already swinging down. Callan dropped the rifle and caught the man's wrist with both hands, feeling the blade stop inches from his throat. They struggled, locked together, the rider's horse dancing nervously beneath them. Callan could smell leather and sweat and the copper tang of blood. Whether his or someone else's, he didn't know. Then the rider jerked and went limp, sliding from his saddle. Behind him, Ayanna stood with the pitchfork, its tines red. Her face was pale, and the bandage at her side was completely soaked through with fresh blood. Dakota was on his feet, limping but alive, his injured horse running off toward the horizon. He looked at his two companions, one groaning on the ground, the other not moving, and then at Ayanna and Callan standing together. Whatever he saw in that moment made him choose survival over vengeance. He ran. Callan watched him disappear into the brush, knowing they'd just made an enemy who wouldn't stop. But before he could process that thought, Ayanna's knees buckled. He caught her before she hit the ground, and this time when he felt the warmth of her blood against his hands, he knew she'd torn something vital. "Your father," he said urgently. "How do I find him?" "You don't," she whispered. "He finds you." Then she was unconscious again, and Callan was alone with two bodies in his yard, a wounded woman in his arms, and the certainty that everything was about to get much worse before it got better. They arrived at dawn. Callan had spent the night keeping Ayanna alive, changing bandages with torn bedsheets, forcing water between her lips when she was conscious enough to swallow. He'd dragged the body of the dead rider into the barn and tied up the wounded one, who'd regained consciousness and immediately started threatening everything from slow death to complete destruction of Callan's land. Callan had gagged him with a strip of cloth and tried not to think about what he'd done, what line he'd crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. When he heard the horses, he knew immediately these weren't more of Takota's people. There were too many of them, and they moved with a discipline that spoke of real warriors, not traitors and thieves. He counted 15 riders as they crested the hill, all armed, all moving in formation toward his ranch. Callan stepped out onto his porch, unarmed this time. Fighting wasn't an option anymore. Whatever happened next was beyond his control. The riders stopped 50 feet from his house. The man at their center sat his horse like he'd been born in the saddle, and even from that distance, Callan could see the authority in how he held himself. He wore a headdress of eagle feathers that marked him as someone of significant standing, and his face was carved with lines that spoke of years bearing heavy decisions. "I am Otakte," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "And I believe you have my daughter." Callan's throat was dry. "She's inside, wounded but alive." Takota ran. "Two of his men are here, one dead, one tied up in the barn." Otakte's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. He made a gesture, and two warriors dismounted and moved past Callan into the house while two others headed to the barn. Callan didn't try to stop them. A moment later, the first pair emerged carrying Ayanna between them, her head lolling against one warrior's chest. The other two dragged out the bound rider, who thrashed uselessly against his restraints as they hauled him toward their horses. The chief rode forward then, his horse stopping directly in front of Callan. Up close, Otakte was even more imposing, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's core. He looked at Callan for a long moment, then at his daughter being carefully laid on a blanket one of the warriors had spread on the ground. "You protected her," Otakte said. "It wasn't a question." "I did." "Why?" Callan almost laughed. He'd been asking himself the same thing for the past day. "Because she needed help, and leaving her to die wasn't something I could live with. You risked your life, killed a man, made enemies." Otakte's gaze moved past Callan to the ranch house, to the dying fields beyond. "For a woman whose people you don't know, whose language you don't speak. Yes, that's either very brave or very foolish. Probably both," Callan admitted. Otakte studied him for another long moment, then dismounted. He walked to where his daughter lay, knelt beside her, and placed one hand on her forehead. The gesture was so tender, it made Callan look away, feeling like he was intruding on something private. "She'll live," one of the warriors said quietly. "The wounds are clean, well tended. Someone knew what they were doing." Otakte stood and returned to Callan. "You saved my daughter's life. That creates a debt. I don't want anything," Callan said automatically. "Nonetheless, a debt exists." The chief's eyes moved to the letter tacked to Callan's door, the final notice from his creditors, yellowed and curling in the sun. "How much do you owe?" Callan felt his face flush. "That's not your concern." "How much?" The number felt like gravel in Callan's mouth. $400, plus interest. It was more money than Callan would see in 5 years of good harvests, more than his father had ever held at one time. Impossible money, the kind of debt that destroyed men. Otakte nodded slowly. "Then that debt is paid. My warriors will bring you gold tomorrow." Callan stared at him. "I can't accept that." "You can and you will. My daughter's life is worth more than any amount of gold." The chief's expression hardened. and refusing would dishonor both of us. Before Callan could respond, Ayanna stirred, her eyes opening. She saw her father and something like relief crossed her face, followed immediately by concern. "The farmer," she said weakly. "Don't let Takota. Takota will be found," Otaktai said gently. "And when he is, he'll answer for what he's done. To you, and to our people." She relaxed then, her eyes closing again, and Callan stood there, watching the chief who just offered to pay a stranger's debts, wondering how a single act of conscience had turned his entire world inside out. Otaktai's warriors made camp near the creek that bordered Callan's property. They moved with practiced efficiency, setting up shelters and tending to their horses while 3 of them remained with Ayanna, preparing medicines from plants Callan didn't recognize. He watched from his porch, feeling like a stranger on his own land, uncertain of his place in whatever was unfolding. The chief approached as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the dying fields. He didn't ask permission before sitting on the porch steps beside Callan, just lowered himself with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged wherever he chose to be. "You're troubled," Otaktai said. Callan almost denied it, then realized there was no point in lying to a man who seemed to read people the way others read trail signs. "I killed a man yesterday. First time I've done that. And you wonder if it makes you something you don't want to be." Something like that. Otaktai was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the horizon. "I have killed many men, some in battle, some in judgment. Each time I asked myself the same question, does this diminish who I am, or define who I must be?" He looked at Callan. "The answer is neither. You are not the killing. You are what you chose to protect." The words settled over Callan like a weight and a relief at the same time. "Your men say Ayanna will recover." "Yes, thanks to you." The chief's expression shifted, something almost like curiosity crossing his features. "You could have let her die, avoided all of this trouble, all this danger. Why didn't you?" Callan had been asking himself that question for 2 days. "My father used to say that a man's measure isn't in what he owns or what he builds. It's in what he does when nobody's watching, when there's no reward for doing right." He gestured at his failing ranch. "All this was supposed to be my legacy, something to pass on. But what's the point of owning land if you lose yourself trying to keep it?" Otaktai studied him with renewed interest. "Your father was wise. He was stubborn and proud, and it got him killed, working himself to death trying to make this place profitable." Callan's voice caught. "I'm just like him." "No," Otaktai said firmly. "Your father worked for land. You risked everything for a life. Those are not the same thing." Before Callan could respond, one of the warriors approached and spoke quickly in their language. Otaktai's expression darkened, and he stood. "Takota has been seen near the settlement. He's gathering men settlers who don't understand what he's truly planning, who see only the promise of new land." The chief's jaw tightened. "He'll try again. And next time, he'll bring enough force that even my warriors may not be enough to stop him." Callan felt ice in his stomach. He wants revenge. He wants what he's always wanted, power. My daughter exposed him, and you helped her survive to tell the truth. He can't allow either of you to live, not if he wants to maintain any influence. Otaktai placed a hand on Callan's shoulder. "I'm leaving 10 warriors here. They'll protect you and my daughter while I take the rest to hunt Takota down. I don't need protection. You killed one of his men and humiliated him in front of his companions. He'll come for you, and he'll bring others." The chief's grip tightened. "This is not pride, farmer. This is reality. Accept the help." Callan wanted to argue, wanted to insist he could handle his own problems, but he'd learned enough in the past 2 days to know when stubbornness became stupidity. "How long will you be gone?" "As long as it takes." Otaktai released him and moved toward his horse. "The gold will arrive tomorrow at midday. My son will bring it. Accept it with the honor it's meant to carry." "What if I can't?" The words came out before Callan could stop them. "What if I can't accept payment for doing what any decent person should have done?" Otaktai turned back, and for the first time something like a smile touched his face. "Then you're even more like your father than you realize. Stubborn, proud." He mounted his horse, "but also honorable. And that, farmer, is the rarest thing in this territory." He rode off with 5 warriors, leaving 10 behind, and Callan sat on his porch, watching darkness fall, knowing that tomorrow would bring gold and answers, but also knowing that the hardest decisions still lay ahead. They came at midday, exactly as Otaktai had promised. 3 riders carrying leather pouches that clinked with the unmistakable sound of metal. The lead rider was younger than the chief, but carried himself with similar authority, Otakte's son no doubt. He dismounted and approached Callan with measured steps. "I am Maka," he said, "and I bring payment for a debt that can never truly be repaid." He opened the pouches on Callan's porch, and gold coins spilled across the weathered wood. More gold than Callan had ever seen in one place. More than enough to settle every debt and still have money left over for seed, for repairs, for everything his ranch needed to survive. Callan stared at it, feeling sick. "This isn't right," he said quietly. Maka's expression didn't change. "My father explained you might feel this way. He asked me to tell you something." He straightened, his voice taking on the cadence of someone repeating words carefully memorized. "Honor is not diminished by accepting help, only by refusing it when offered with genuine respect. The gold is not payment for what you did. No amount of gold equals my sister's life. It is recognition of the debt our family owes you, and refusing it would dishonor both our peoples." Before Callan could respond, Ayana's voice came from the doorway. "He's right." She was standing, though barely, one hand pressed against the door frame. She'd been moved to Callan's house the previous evening, his own bed given over to her recovery while he slept on the floor. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were clear and steady. "You should be resting," Callan said. "I've been resting." She took a careful step onto the porch, and lying there, listening to the warriors talk about how my father is hunting the man who tried to kill me, I realized something. She looked at the gold, then at Callan. "You saved my life twice. Once when you found me, and again when you stood between me and Dakota's blade. That deserves more than gold. But gold is what we have to offer. I didn't do it for payment. I know." She moved closer, each step clearly causing pain. "That's exactly why you deserve it. Anyone who saves a life expecting reward is just making an investment. You saved mine because it was the right thing to do, and that makes you either the most honorable man I've met or the most foolish. Your father said the same thing." A slight smile touched her lips. "We agree on more than he'd like to admit." The smile faded. "Dakota will come back. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he will. And when he does, he'll bring enough men to overwhelm even my father's warriors. You need to be ready. I'm not a fighter. No. But you're a survivor. I saw it in your eyes when you found Methat's stubborn refusal to give up even when everything is falling apart around you." She gestured at the gold. "This gives you options. You can rebuild. You can hire help. You can finally stop watching your land die while you work yourself to death trying to save it alone." Callan looked at the gold again. Then, at his ranch, the cracked earth, the leaning barn, the house his father had built with his own hands. Everything he'd been trying to save, everything that had been slowly killing him. "If I take this," he said slowly, "it changes things between your people and mine. It already changed the moment you carried me into your barn." Ayana met his eyes. "The question isn't whether things have changed. It's whether you're brave enough to accept what that change means." Maka cleared his throat. "I must return to my father. Do you accept the debt payment?" The words hung in the air. Behind them, Callan could hear the warriors at their camp, could smell smoke from their fires mixing with the dust of his dying fields. Accepting meant acknowledging a bond between himself and these people, meant stepping into a relationship that would mark him for the rest of his life. Refusing meant maintaining his pride while his ranch crumbled and his father's legacy turned to dust. "I accept," he said, and the words felt like both surrender and salvation. Maka nodded once, satisfied, then mounted his horse and rode back toward the tribal camp. Ayana remained on the porch, watching Callan as he stared at the gold that would save everything he'd been trying to hold on to. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not letting pride destroy you. Too many good men have." She turned toward the door, then paused. "My father will find Dakota, and when he does, this will truly be over." But as Callan gathered the gold and carried it inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over at all, that in some ways, it was only beginning. 5 days after Maka delivered the gold, Otakte returned. Callan was repairing the fence around his corral when he saw the dust cloud approaching, and his stomach tightened until he recognized the chief's distinctive profile at the head of the riders. They came in fast, but not with the urgency of men fleeing danger, with the satisfied pace of warriors returning from a successful hunt. Otakte dismounted and walked directly to where Callan stood, his expression unreadable. It's done. Dakota won't trouble you or my daughter again. Callan didn't ask for details. Some things were better left as simple facts. And the settlers he was gathering? Most scattered when they learned the truth about his plans. The few who remained loyal to him. The chief's jaw tightened. They made their choice. Now they live with the consequences. Behind them, Ayanna emerged from the house. She'd regained her strength over the past days. And though she still moved carefully, the color had returned to her face. She walked to her father and they embraced, speaking quietly in their language. Callan turned back to his fence, giving them privacy. When they finished, Ayanna approached him. We leave today. My father's people need to see that I'm well, that the threat has passed. Callan nodded, unable to find words that matched what he was feeling. This woman had crashed into his life, brought violence and danger and impossible choices. And somehow in the chaos of it all, she'd also brought purpose. The gold, she said. You've already paid the creditors? Yesterday. Rode to town myself. Settled every debt in full. He managed a small smile. The looks on their faces when I emptied those pouches on their desks, I'll remember that for the rest of my life. And what will you do now? Rebuild. Hire help. Plant crops that actually have a chance of surviving in this soil instead of trying to force what my father planted. He looked at his land, seeing it differently now. Start fresh, I suppose. That takes courage. So does what you did exposing Dakota, knowing what it might cost. She was quiet for a moment. My father says you and I are alike, too stubborn to quit even when quitting would be easier. She held out her hand. I hope our paths cross again. Callan Whitmore, though perhaps next time under less violent circumstances. He took her hand, feeling the strength in her grip. I hope so too. Otakte approached, and Callan straightened, suddenly aware this might be the last time he'd speak to the man who'd saved his ranch and possibly his life. Chief, No. Otakte raised a hand. No more thanks, no more debt. What was between us is settled. But, he paused, choosing his words carefully. You are known now to my people. If you ever need help, if trouble finds you again, send word to the canyon lands in the north. We will answer. The weight of that promise settled over Callan like a blanket. Protection. Alliance. Things his father would never have imagined possible between their two worlds. I won't forget that, Callan said. I know you won't. That's why I offer it. The chief mounted his horse, and his warriors did the same. Ayanna took one last look at Callan's ranch, at the man who'd risked everything for a stranger, then swung up onto her own horse with fluid grace. They rode out in formation, and Callan stood watching until they disappeared over the hill. The sun was high, burning down on land that was his again, truly his, free from the weight of impossible debt.